All right, Chillcast MMA. I'm joined once again by Austin Brodie, MMAPanic, and this time we got another chill episode for you guys, another relaxed conversation. So like I said on the last one, the year's ended down. Everyone's getting their end of decade, end of year lists. They're getting all that together, and everyone's starting to look ahead to next year. And not to mention, we did have some fights go down recently over the past week, so we can obviously talk about that as well. So there's been a lot going on. We can take this big picture, we can start small picture. But when you think MMA in 2019, what do you think of?
For me, the biggest thing I think of is Israel Adesanya. We seen him join the UFC last year. He ran through his opponents last year. This year, coming into this year, how many people, maybe there was some, but thought that he would be as dominant as he's been. He at the beginning of the year, he beat Anderson Silva in a very skilled striker matchup. Then he goes on to have what is probably the best fight of the year against Gastelum, and then to knock out Whitaker in Australia. There's not been many years in MMA better than what Adesanya has done this year.
Yeah, and that is true. You think about it, that whole, I guess when we see prospects or guys come into the UFC, the big thing is how long until they get a title shot. And it's like when you throw that many guys up against the wall, it's like not so many stick. It's like you do get guys like Cody Garbrandt, but when you think of like Dominic Reyes or Anthony Smith, it's like guys get going, and after a while we start thinking like, all right, this is their chance now. And Adesanya, he's one of those guys that I think it's safe to say people were on him a little bit early, right? It feels like he had a little bit of that John Jones to him, a little bit of that extra spice where we could see a little bit extra. But for him to actually come through and deliver this year, you're right, that is a huge story of the year. When you think of 2019 and you think of the big stories, do you think that that's on your number one? That's your guy?
Yeah, I would say so. For me, it is. There have obviously been a lot of big ones. Masvidal's year, the Ben Askren fight, and the BMF belt itself is a big story. There's been a ton of other ones. The Cejudo becoming a double champion, TJ testing positive for EPO, Conor's legal troubles. There's been a lot of stories, but yeah, to me, that's what stands out the most when I look back at like what this year has, what we've learned from this year. To me, it's mostly about Israel Adesanya.
Yeah, for me, I'm gonna go outside the cage. For me, it's MMA tapping into my freaking phone, credit card, Apple Pay. That's what it is. The story is MMA making me download all these apps, taking up my bandwidth, jacking up my mobile bill. That's my story. You got the Zone on one hand, you got Flow. Well, they've sort of been out here. That's not really anything new. But then you got ESPN Plus. I think the biggest story outside of the cage has been these apps. What's going on? Who's going to stick around? What gets consolidated? Do more add to the mix if business is booming? What happens if business is not? That's my story. But inside the cage, I don't know. When I think about sort of the year as a whole, obviously it's like you said, Adesanya. That would have been a layup, and that is a solid one because he's sure come of age in a short time, and it feels like his stories had so much upside. So I'm definitely not going to get mad at that. But for me, it feels like my story inside the cage person that I feel like developed the most this year is Kevin Lee, and I feel like he came of age in a different manner. There's no championship implications when you talk about 2019 for Kevin Lee, but so why do I pick him? Because I feel like he came into this year with the loss. He added another loss on top of that. He only fought twice, but in him only having two outings, when I look at the entire UFC roster and MMA as a whole, I can't think of one fighter that made me feel so darn much in so little outings. I feel like I went from hating the guy to wanting him to, change camps and change weight classes, and maybe you should get cut at some points into, what, maybe you're that guy. Maybe you can stick around. When I think of the story of the year, I think of outside of the cage, you have to have that it factor. So like a Adesanya or someone like John Jones who just compiled multiple wins, if you want to just look at it like that. But you have that outside of the cage factor, but then inside of the cage, in only 2 outings, I feel like I got to learn a lot about the low side of his skill set, the upside of his skill set. I feel like there is a ceiling there that can be reached over the next year, so I can forecast a bit. I feel like this can be revisited a year or two in the future. And also, I just think that if you put all of it together, when we look back on 2019 and we look at the big stories, we will say, well, this was a turning year for someone that I believe will be a fixture. And that fixture that came out of 2019 for me, Kevin Lee. So when you hear me say that, obviously polarizing name, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great one. I agree, and that's a tribute to Kevin Lee, who was honest with himself and realized that his training and what was going on in his life wasn't conducive to being a UFC champion. And we kind of got to see that firsthand, and it's like the cracks that he was having to fix when he went on Joe Rogan's podcast. And then he started training at TriStar with Faraz and them, and then he looked like a world beater against Gregor Gillespie. So, yeah, that's a great one. I'm super excited to see what he does in the lightweight division in 2020. I mean, he's a real contender. And to piggyback off what you start off with, with all the abs and stuff, another big story, outside the cage is just the UFC joining ESPN. I forgot that happened at the beginning of the year. So I think that was a big jump. I mean, people, as far as pay-per-views, I don't know if it's a better or worse, whatever, but to be on ESPN was a huge change for the UFC this year. And but yeah, Kevin Lee is a great one. That was like probably the knockout of the year, coming off of what was a couple of bad outings for Kevin Lee. So yeah, that was fun to see. And I think what you said, where you started off maybe not liking him, and then it goes towards like, oh, I mean, it turned into a real feel good moment. I think that happened to all of us. I think most MMA fans that follow it had a kind of a sour opinion on Kevin Lee and some of the stuff he was doing, saying, and then we all kind of wanted to see him do better. And then once we seen him get serious about changing camps and stuff, and then that fight with Gillespie and that head kick, I mean, that was definitely one of the
And for me,
better feel good moments of the year.
and obviously I'm going to throw this back to you. And anyone listening to this, obviously you can let us know, what do you think? Who are your picks? We want to hear from you guys as well. And once again, you can find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. You can find Austin at MMAPanic. This is Showcast MMA. But yeah, getting back to this, my runner-up would be Henry Cejudo. And we can talk about the DJ fight, and I know that's always going to be a talking point for him, probably for the rest of his career, depending on what happens down the line with him. But you talk about the champ era. He's in that rarefied club now. He started off the year, we talk about the ESPN era. He kicked that whole thing off. The first card, obviously the first fight card was on main ESPN, was Cain Velasquez and Francis Ngannou. But if you talk about the entire era as a whole, he kicked it off with TJ Dillashaw in Brooklyn. And that was controversial, sort of, I guess, and that goes in hand with what I was saying before. But the reason why he's my runner-up is not only was he able to, have a successful campaign this year inside the cage, but outside the cage, he went from being just another guy with a belt across his shoulders to adding a second one, which you got to give him kudos for. That's a rare club in MMA. And to do it in 1 year and to sustain it and to have fights booked coming back for the future so we can forecast with him as well. Same thing with Adesanya. Same thing with Kevin Lee. So he checks that as well. And say what you want about him, polarizing. We talk about going from liking a guy to hating a guy, or hating a guy to liking a guy. He checks that box as well. So he's my runner-up. But who's your runner-up?
Yeah, I think I already mentioned it, but my runner-up was Masvidal. For similar reasons for what you just said. I agree with Cejudo's. Cejudo's thing, I think he's a little bit of a victim of having his fights earlier in the year and then being injured and being out the rest of the year. So people kind of forgot. But like, if this was, August or whatever, we would be talking about how like he's shooing for fight of the year because he goes down and beats TJ, or he beats TJ for the flyweight title and then goes up and beats Mariah. So yeah, he's a great one. But then I think people in those months that he wasn't fighting, you had the rise of Adesanya and Masvidal. But Masvidal's mine because everyone knows, he went from being on a losing streak to not fighting for a year to doing like South American reality shows, and then came back with a huge knockout over Till that kind of set the world on fire. And then the Askren fight that had so much buildup and so much stakes, and that fight card had a lot of big fights on it, but that was definitely the one everyone was looking most forward to. And then it's the fastest knockout of all time. I mean, that was pretty crazy. And then to headline the Garden against Nate Diaz for a belt that they just created, I mean, that was incredible. And he had an incredible fight too against Diaz. He kind of ran through Diaz for 3 rounds, and then the cut was what it was, and we don't know what would happen. But for me, the runner-up is Masvidal.
Obviously, that's not a bad choice either. Masvidal, when I think of him, I just think of he had a Nate Diaz year. He had a year where he started off, we were like, okay, he's kind of a journeyman in the middle of the road, and now as we sit here heading into 2020, again, talk about forecasting, we can do that with him. He's starting to build up a brand, the Miami Vice vibe. People are feeling that. And as far as mainstream, when he did his ESPN car wash, you could tell people were sort of feeling that as far as their personalities and stuff. And that's always a check mark. But then, hey, like you just said, to be able to have a successful campaign inside the cage, that's obviously another good choice as well. Now, I guess to try and switch it up some, since we're just talking about end of year and talking about 2020, I'll ask you in 2 different ways. So who do you think has to have inside the cage? Let's start inside the cage. Who do you think has to have the biggest 2020 to either get back to prominence or to advance their career? Or if that's sort of like a little bit too open-ended, who do you think fell off the most this past year?
Yeah, that's a really great question. My first answer is the mainstream answer. The person that needs to have the best in-ring, in-cage performance of 2020, it's got to be Conor McGregor. He hasn't won the UFC since like 2016. He's in legal trouble after legal trouble. The public opinion on him kind of soured a little bit. It's not as pro Conor as it used to be. He has a good opportunity against Cowboy, someone that he should go in there. Cowboy's no punk. I'm not saying that, but it's someone that is a good, for a ranked lightweight, that's a good matchup. I know it's at welterweight, but it's a good matchup for Conor, especially if he wants to get, one of those more lucrative fights with Masvidal or Khabib down the road. But just for another answer, Holly Holm is another one, I think. She has a fight coming up with Raquel Pennington, I'm pretty sure. But, she's someone that you're getting to the point of, with the UFC just releasing someone like Liz Carmouche, who had 2 shots at the title and didn't get close. Like, at what point are they going to make the decision that Holly Holm, can't get it done in a championship fight? She's failed on multiple occasions. She's still, at this point, I hate to say it, but she's still at this point riding off of that Ronda Rousey head kick that was, 4 years ago or whatever. So, and she's had some good performances since, but when it's that title fight or whatever, she isn't stepping up to what people think of her, and it's not, her performances in the cage aren't matching up with what her hype has been, and I think that hype is slowly going down. And I think if she loses a couple more fights, I don't know what you do with her.
That's I wasn't even thinking about Holly Holm at all, but that's true, and she didn't flirt with retiring this past year, but that talk did start to surround her just as a narrative. So again, like you said, and just laid out there, that could be something heading into 2020 that we got to keep an eye on. For me, I think the person that fell off the most this past year was TJ Dillashaw. You start off this year, look at going into this year, all of the different fight narratives and different options, and DJ left the UFC and was supposed to fight him, and Cejudo came up and he was supposed to squash him. Like, remember that was a narrative going into that card, and like for him to lose that one controversially in quick time, and then before he can even fully rally from that, he gets a double blow with the USADA Wolves, and now he's out. And it's just when I think of 2019, I think of guys that like when I think of like falling off, I'm talking about you came into this year hot and you now Adesanya, in my opinion, had he lost to Whitaker, I would have said him by default. Like because that's the guy that came in steaming hot. And I think of Dillashaw and just thinking back, like, man, he started off this year. He was the man. He was the man, and he had reclaimed some of that glory. He had dealt with Garbrandt. Cruz was on this shelf, and it was like, yo, he's good. Like he's on his way to becoming that guy, and it just did not happen. He wanted to go for the champ thing, and boy, did that just completely blow up in his face. He got the exact opposite of what he wanted when he started this year. And when I think of who has to have a big 2020, I don't know in terms of who has to have a like I don't know if this person has to have a big one in terms of getting some sort of great prominence, but in terms of getting some sort of relevance and becoming a name or not, MVP. There is no way in the world you go through all of 2020 without fighting a real name. And this time next year, we still sit here and look at you as a legitimate name within our sport. I don't believe you have another year left in you. I think this was the last year you get away with that. So those are my two names. So any reaction to that?
Yeah, those are great ones. And to the TJ point, yeah, I didn't even think about him because he's been so out of my mind for a while. But yeah, and if he comes back this year and if he loses, then the narrative will always be that he only won anything because he was
Which, not to
on
cut you
steroids.
off, he's
Which,
not even
whether
allowed
that's
to come
true with
back,
the
I don't
proof they
believe,
have or
until
whatever.
2021.
Oh, see, yeah. So even that, he's not even gonna get a year. But regardless, when he comes back, he's gonna have to win, or else people are gonna always connect him with the link. Like the guys that were good, and then USADA came and they started going down. But yeah, and I completely agree with your point on MVP. It's Bellator is one of the worst leagues as far as like having a star they want to be a star and putting him up against cans. But I've never really seen someone go in MMA, not boxing. But I've never seen someone go, all right, MVP crushed cans, and then he started going against actual welterweights, and then has a devastating defeat, and now he's back to crushing cans. I can understand that if you want to go back, like, hey, let's get a win or a couple wins under his belt. But now we're at like 3 like fights in a row against guys that just shouldn't be in there with MVP, and it's really a disservice to MVP. I mean, I don't know if it's him or Scott Coker are the ones wanting to do this because, like you said, like the MMA media and the MMA fans that are on Twitter and stuff, that they're not respecting what he's his skill set as much as they used to, because they know he's going to win the fight before he goes into it. So I think Bellator's doing him a real
that's my
disservice
pick on that. And yeah, and I guess I didn't respond to your pick on McGregor. That again, yeah, like you did say, that is a mainstream choice. I'm pretty sure he's going to be on a lot of people's list for just anything this year and coming up for next year. And to his credit, he does finally have a fight book. I do believe it's Donald Cerrone, and I see it's iffy with these things because they didn't officially release it. And what does that mean? Because their version of officially releasing or announcing a fight is dropping a trailer in the middle of a press conference. So we don't know how that works, but basically he's fighting Donald Cerrone, and it's going to be interesting to see because boy have a lot.
I actually think
so that's like set in stone, and
not 100%. I'm not 100%, but I've seen they're having a press conference, and I've read online that it's going to feature Conor and Cowboy.